Right then, folks, this is the US market rundown on Tuesday, the 20th of June. We'll just look into the headlines, flick across the headlines, we'll jump onto the monitor, see what is up, what is down, and then we'll jump over to some charts now in a minute, and we will see what we can find. But just to start the day overnight, the People's Bank of China, PBOC, cut interest rates by less than what was expected by markets. And markets had hoped that they would lend a little bit more support to the economy in order to spur economic growth after a slight bit of a lackluster growth picture in China post exiting their strict lockdown measures. Now, we may have to see some potential more kind of specific measures to more specifics. Right then, this is the US market rundown on Tuesday, the 20th of June. We'll just look into the headlines, flick across the headlines, we'll see what is going on, what bits of news is circulating through markets at the moment as we head into the US session, the first cash trading session of the week, with yesterday the US celebrating Juneteenth and it being a bank holiday in the US yesterday. But a little bit overnight, a little bit of negativity overnight surrounding the PBOC, People's Bank of China. They did cut interest rates yesterday in order to lend support to the economy after a somewhat lackluster reopening since their COVID measures got removed. Obviously, the strictest COVID measures in the world obviously puts a dent on economic growth, and they have not gained as much growth as markets or maybe them themselves had anticipated. So they have cut interest rates overnight, not as much as markets were hoping and anticipating for. So slight bit of a negative start to the day, certainly across the European session, which we will have a look at once we get around to some charts in a minute. You can see up here, US stocks futures fall as hawkish Fed and smaller China rate cut dent sentiment. So markets still kind of toing and froing about last week's interest rate hike, but it was a pause last week, but potential for interest rates to be slightly higher than what markets had initially priced in. We do have Jerome Powell giving his semi-annual update on monetary policy over the course of tomorrow and Thursday, which is something we need to look out for. So potentially some market participants positioning themselves ahead of that, but also maybe some profit taking off the moves of the last couple of weeks. So I'll jump across some charts now in a minute. We will have a look at that. But apart from that, not really a great deal. Not really a great deal of price movement. Speak a little bit about the Australian dollar once we get across to the charts. The minutes out of Australia this morning suggested that the board were considering no interest rate hike at the last meeting, which was slightly contradictory to the impression that we got after that, where the hike was kind of a foregone conclusion and they may look to hike interest rates further. Shows potential for a lack of interest rate hikes going forward, which is not really what we had thought as market participants. So slight bit of downside across the board on the Australian dollar, which you can see when we jump across to this Aussie sorry, the Australian dollar lower across the board off the back of the minutes markets then having less of a hope for interest rate hikes going forward. You then look to the Chinese economy, where they've cut interest rates and also then not cut interest rates as much as some market participants may have hoped for. That's kind of a double whammy in terms of the Aussie dollar. Kiwi dollar then gets dragged lower with that. We can see the Canadian dollar, euro, sterling, Swiss franc all a bit choppy. Japanese yen relatively strong across the board, or the strongest currency across the board over the course of today. But it's just a bit of a pullback against the moves. Probably due to the fact that US yields are slightly lower. We'll have a jump across to some charts now in a minute, where you can see US bonds over here, red across the board, bonds being purchased, yields then lower. You can see yields then across the board then lower, which does help the Japanese yen. So that's a contributing factor to some Japanese yen upside over the course of today. US dollar relatively strong off the back of what we were just speaking about. Potential for some dollar upside. Slightly more hawkish Fed last week, which was kind of surprising that the dollar continued to sell off the back of that, but have seen some dollar strength over the course of this week so far, and that is probably set to continue into Jerome Powell later on this week. Maybe he adds fuel to that fire, and the markets continue to trade the way they are. But US stock indexes are lower, Asia Pacific stock indexes are lower. The DAX is lower, but pretty mixed bag across European equity futures, but mainly US equity futures, Asia Pacific equity futures lower, and then commodities lower as well. So slight bit of risk off trading to over the course of the European session. Nothing major, no drastic moves anywhere, but slight bit of negativity in markets today, which is a bit of a follow through from yesterday, where there was also a bit of negativity. So a bit of a negative start to the week, as we can see here, and that is a bit of a negative start to the week, and that is kind of where we are at. But no massive moves over the course of this week so far, as the US haven't even logged on for trading yet this week. So today becomes kind of a Monday. Yesterday a slight bit of a nothing day, but obviously we'll have to see how the US fare going into today's trade. But into today's trade, you can see some positive data releases, some positive housing market figures. You can see building permits up from consensus and up from last month. You can see housing starts up 21.7% over the month of May. Building permits up 5.2%. Housing starts in terms of a figure, not a percentage, higher than last month, higher than consensus. So some pretty positive housing figures across the board out of the US today. All right, and that has then obviously contributed to some stocks lower. You can see, I guess a bit of a pullback against the trend, but it is still stocks lower at the moment. Right, obviously there's a bit more downside in the DAX, obviously probably off the back of some positive or some hawkish remarks from the ECB yesterday, suggesting that they were going to continue to hike interest rates, or an increase or further increase in interest rates would be appropriate. So it's kind of helped push the DAX lower, but you can see kind of across the board, if we go more intraday time frame down to the 1 hour, bit of negativity across the S&P, the Dow, the Nasdaq. Russell pretty flat, but you can see the DAX, the FTSE and the Nikkei all lower across the board. We'll jump across to the US dollar, and you can see some definite negativity over the course of today. You can see the Australian dollar. Obviously, we spoke a bit about the Australian dollar earlier. That continues to move lower over the course of the European session. The Kiwi then continues to move lower, and you got dollar Swiss grinding higher. You got dollar CAD grinding higher. Euro dollar pretty flat, but it's making an attempt at these lows, which I think is probably a significant level heading into today's US session, as really there's no other support until we get down to kind of 108 the figure. So definitely something worth keeping an eye on euro dollar is this little support level that is folding as we speak, or is being tested as we speak. If that folds, opens up some more potential downside back towards 108 the figure. Cable then through the lows this morning and has continued lower over the course of today's session. Dollar yen, a slight bit tricky with some Japanese yen strength across the board, but you can see the dollar index also grinding higher, attempting to break through those highs at 102.60. So US dollar strength across the board, which is a slight bit of a contradiction to this US 10-year yield, but yields are pretty flat. Still manages to hold on to that trend line that we are looking at. Maybe we can adjust it now as we are kind of getting a little bit more perfect, but we're at that trend line now. Does that hold or does that fold? Obviously that remains to be seen. That level to the top side of 3.885 is important, but if we do get some hawkish remarks out of Jerome Powell over the course of the rest of this week, then that is likely to then turn higher. If that then turns higher, likely to prove supportive for the US dollar and then prove negative for stocks. Right, we can see oil pretty flat. I was looking at oil, up at these highs earlier on. Unfortunately, did not manage to break through that 72 round number and has then pushed back lower. But now we're back at these lows, and if history is to repeat itself, the last few times that we've been at this lows, prices have been picked up. So it'll be interesting to see if investors or traders, pick up more of these lows down at the support level, kind of 70, 80. If that then folds, obviously it probably opens up a target, certainly down to 70, maybe even potentially down to 68. Gold kind of moving in with the US dollar at the moment. Gold through the lows just as we speak, as I've started recording this video. And yeah, that is sort of where we are at in terms of trade today. We'll come back to the economic calendar and have a quick look over the course of today's afternoon. There's only a speech at 4:45 UK time today, but then we come into a bit more of a busy day tomorrow. We got UK inflation, which we will update further on in the morning, and then we are into a couple of days of testimony from Jerome Powell, where that is likely to drive price action over the course of this week. So that's what we need to keep an eye on. Not a lot today in terms of fresh headlines, but maybe these moves continue due to the fact that there is no fresh impetus from the calendar. Bit of negativity this morning off the back of lower than anticipated, less than hoped for interest rate cuts from China. Maybe markets positioning themselves ahead of Jerome Powell's testimony later on this week, and it is an important testimony, as it is a testimony on monetary policy. So sometimes they can speak about climate change, these central bank officials and stuff, but this is a semi-annual report on monetary policy, so is something we need to keep our eyes on over the course of this week. But definitely some negativity in markets yesterday and today, but obviously the US log on in about 20 minutes from now, and they could easily turn that back around. But this is their first trading today. I haven't had a chance to react after they have digested last week's information over the weekend. And yeah, difficult to predict some direction heading into the US session, but as we go into the US session, but as over the course of this morning and over the course of yesterday, seems to be stocks lower, dollar higher is the movement over the course of the last couple of days.